Welcome, beloved anointed ones. The world has a strange habit. It crucifies the person who refuses to wear the mask everyone else agreed to. By the time it discovers the truth, the damage has already been done. History has repeated this pattern more times than people care to admit. The individuals who challenged, accepted thinking, exposed uncomfortable realities, or simply refused to play by unwritten rules were rarely welcomed with applause. They were mocked, isolated, slandered, and treated like enemies before many were later recognized for the very qualities that made them dangerous in the first place. Human nature hasn't changed much. We still judge what threatens our comfort long before we understand its purpose. There is another uncomfortable truth people rarely talk about. Society doesn't always create villains because they exist. Sometimes it creates them because it desperately needs someone to blame. One person becomes the container for everyone's fear, jealousy, frustration, and guilt. Once that label sticks, facts become optional. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every success becomes manipulation. Every mistake becomes proof that the story was true all along. It's almost impressive how fast a rumor can earn a PhD in people's minds. But beneath every false label lies a deeper battle. What if the person everyone hunted was never the danger? What if they were the disruption that exposed hidden corruption? What if the one chased from every circle wasn't carrying destruction, but transformation? That possibility makes people uncomfortable because it forces them to reconsider who the real villain was from the beginning. Today's message is about one of the oldest patterns in human history. The moment someone is branded an outcast, hunted without mercy, and painted as the enemy, only for time to reveal they were carrying the very truth others prayed for but refused to recognize. This isn't just about rejection, it's about projection, power, fear, and the extraordinary cost of refusing to betray who you are. Stay with me, because each point pulls back another layer of a story that most people live through but very few ever understand. Number 1. They needed a villain because the truth had no other face. There is something deeply unsettling about a person who quietly exposes what everyone else has learned to ignore. You didn't have to make speeches, start arguments, or declare yourself right. Sometimes your honesty, your refusal to play along, or simply your presence was enough to make people uncomfortable. The problem was never that you carried lies. The problem was that you stood too close to the truth. And truth has a way of making carefully built illusions feel fragile. When people invest years protecting a false story, they begin protecting that story as if it were their identity. The moment someone challenges it, even without trying, they feel personally attacked. Instead of asking, "What if this person has a point?" they ask, "How do we stop this person?" That is where the villain is born. Not through facts, but through fear. It becomes easier to question your character than to question their beliefs. This is why some of the kindest people end up carrying the darkest reputations. Once a group decides who the villain is, everything that person does gets filtered through suspicion. Your kindness becomes manipulation. Your confidence becomes arrogance. Your silence becomes guilt. Even your success becomes something people explain away because accepting it would mean admitting they judged you unfairly. The harsh truth is that many people would rather protect a comfortable lie than welcome an uncomfortable truth. A lie allows life to continue without change. The truth demands accountability, and accountability is expensive. It costs pride. It costs excuses. It sometimes costs relationships built on pretending everything was fine. That is why the truth almost always arrives wearing a face people don't want to see. It rarely comes through the loudest voice or the most popular person. It often comes through the one who refuses to bend, refuses to fake agreement, and refuses to trade integrity for acceptance. The crowd may call that person dangerous because they cannot explain the uneasiness they feel around them. In reality, they are not reacting to the person at all. They are reacting to the possibility that everything they defended for years may have been built on a foundation that cannot survive honest light. That is the tragedy of truth. It doesn't create enemies by force. It simply reveals the ones who are already at war with it. Number 2, your presence exposed. Invisible contracts. Everyone else agreed to. Every group has rules that are never written down. Families have them. Friendships have them. Workplaces have them. Communities have them. They are the invisible contracts that quietly tell people what to say, what to ignore, who gets protected, and who gets sacrificed. Most people follow these rules without even realizing they exist because they have been living inside them for so long. They mistake familiarity for truth. Then someone comes along who doesn't fit the script, not because they are trying to start a rebellion, but because pretending feels more exhausting than being honest. Without making a grand announcement, they ask the question everyone else avoids. They refuse to laugh at something that isn't funny. They refuse to praise what they know is wrong. They refuse to stay silent just to keep everyone comfortable. That single decision can shake an entire group more than years of loud arguments ever could. The strange part is that people rarely admit what is really bothering them. They won't say, "You exposed the way we've been protecting this unhealthy pattern." Instead, they invent easier reasons to reject you. Suddenly you're called difficult, proud, stubborn, rebellious, or impossible to please. Those labels sound believable because they keep attention away from the real issue. The issue was never your personality. It was the pressure your integrity placed on everyone else's compromise. What makes these invisible contracts so powerful is that they survive on cooperation. The moment one person refuses to participate, others are forced to see that they actually had a choice all along. That realization is uncomfortable because it removes the excuse of, "I had no other option." It exposes that many decisions were made out of convenience, fear, or the desire to belong. This is why your presence felt disruptive even when you weren't trying to change anyone. You reminded people that living honestly was still possible. You proved that silence wasn't the only option, that courage hadn't disappeared, and that integrity didn't have to be negotiated. For those who secretly wanted freedom, your example became hope. But for those who depended on the invisible contract to protect their comfort, your existence felt like betrayal. You didn't break their world by force. You simply lived as though the chains they accepted had never been real, and that quiet freedom was enough to expose everything they had spent years pretending not to see. Number 3, people punished you for crimes you never committed, because it protected their own conscience. There is a painful truth about human nature that most people never admit. When guilt becomes too heavy to carry, many people look for someone else to carry it for them. Instead of facing their own choices, they find one person to blame. That person becomes the target of every disappointment, every failure, every uncomfortable emotion they don't want to deal with. Once that happens, facts stop mattering. The role has already been assigned. This is why some people are judged long before they are understood. A rumor is accepted faster than an explanation. A false accusation spreads further than the truth because it gives people something they secretly crave, a simple answer to a complicated problem. It allows everyone else to feel innocent without ever examining themselves. The tragedy is that the more you try to defend yourself, the more determined some people become to misunderstand you. They are not searching for evidence. They are searching for confirmation. Every word you speak is twisted to fit the story they have already decided to believe. Your kindness becomes an act. Your patience becomes guilt. Even your silence is treated as proof that you must be hiding something. It becomes a trial where the verdict was written before you ever entered the room. What they fail to realize is that blaming one person never heals a broken group. It only delays the moment when everyone must face the truth. Families repeat the same cycles. Friendships fall apart. Communities become divided. The problems remain because the real cause was never addressed. The scapegoat may disappear, but the dysfunction stays exactly where it was. Over time, something remarkable happens. The truth has a way of surviving without demanding attention. The stories that once sounded convincing begin to fall apart under the weight of their own contradictions. People start noticing the gaps. They remember things that never made sense. They quietly realize that the person they condemned was carrying accusations that belonged somewhere else. In the end, the greatest injustice was never the punishment itself. It was the fact that your suffering became the price others paid to protect their own conscience. They convinced themselves they were defending what was right, when in reality they were defending themselves from the uncomfortable responsibility of looking in the mirror. That is why the innocent are so often treated as guilty, not because they deserve it, but because someone else cannot bear the weight of the truth. Number 4. You interrupted stories that were older than you. Long before you ever entered the room, people had already decided how life was supposed to work. They inherited beliefs from parents, traditions from communities, and habits from generations before them. Many of these ideas were never questioned because they had simply become normal. Over time, those old stories stopped feeling like opinions and started feeling like absolute truth. Then you came along. You didn't necessarily arrive with a plan to challenge anyone. You simply refused to accept something just because that's how it's always been. That alone was enough to unsettle people. Your choices, your questions, and even the way you lived quietly exposed that another path was possible. You interrupted a story that had been repeated for years, and people rarely welcome interruptions when they have built their identity around the script. What makes this so difficult is that many people don't even realize they are defending a story instead of defending the truth. They confuse tradition with wisdom, popularity with correctness, and familiarity with certainty. The moment someone steps outside those boundaries, they don't ask whether the boundaries should exist. They focus on the person who crossed them. That is why you may have been treated like a threat instead of a breath of fresh air. Your life challenged excuses that had survived for decades. It questioned patterns people had stopped noticing. It proved that fear wasn't the only option, and that blind agreement wasn't the same as peace. Without saying much, you showed that people could think for themselves, and that realization can shake an entire system. Old stories fight hard to survive because they are tied to pride. If one person breaks free, others must face the uncomfortable possibility that they could have done the same. That thought is difficult to accept because it means years of compromise were never as unavoidable as they believed. In the end, the resistance was never really about you. It was about protecting narratives that had outlived their purpose. You didn't destroy those stories with force or anger. You simply refused to become another character trapped inside them. And once someone lives outside an old script, everyone else is forced to decide whether they will keep acting out a role that no longer serves them or have the courage to write a new ending. Number 5, they couldn't control your motives, so they invented them. One of the hardest things for controlling people to accept is someone whose decisions cannot be predicted. They are comfortable with people they can read, influence, or manipulate. They know exactly which compliments will work, which criticisms will sting, and which fears will make someone fall back into line. But when they meet a person who acts from conviction instead of approval, they lose their advantage. That uncertainty frustrates them more than open resistance ever could. When people cannot figure out what drives you, many will stop trying to understand and start creating their own explanations. If you keep your distance, they say you're arrogant. If you're generous, they assume you want something in return. If you stay calm during conflict, they accuse you of hiding your true intentions. No matter what you do, they attach a motive that fits the story they already want to believe. The strange part is that these invented motives often reveal more about them than about you. Someone who constantly manipulates others assumes everyone else is doing the same. Someone who lies easily struggles to believe honesty exists. Someone who chases status believes every act of kindness is a strategy for gaining influence. People often judge your heart through the condition of their own. This is why explaining yourself over and over rarely changes anything. You cannot reason with a conclusion that was never built on reason. Some people are not listening to discover the truth. They are listening for words they can twist into evidence for a verdict they reached long ago. Their opinion doesn't grow from your actions, it grows from their assumptions. Over time, this creates a strange freedom. You realize that living honestly is more important than being understood by everyone. Integrity becomes your language, even when others refuse to translate it correctly. You stop chasing the impossible task of controlling every opinion because you understand that some people have already decided who you are without ever taking the time to know you. In the end, the greatest threat you posed was not your strength, your intelligence, or your success. It was the fact that your choices belonged to you. You could not be bought with praise or steered by fear. And when people lose the ability to control your motives, they often invent darker ones, not because they have proof, but because accepting your independence would force them to admit that not everyone can be manipulated the way they can. Number 6. The crowd mistook emotional discomfort for moral danger. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that anything uncomfortable must be harmful. Throughout history, many people have been rejected not because they caused destruction, but because they challenged comfort. They brought ideas, questions, or perspectives that forced others to confront things they had ignored for years. Instead of seeing that discomfort as an opportunity to grow, people often treated it as a warning sign. The human mind naturally seeks stability. Most people prefer familiar problems over unfamiliar solutions because familiar problems feel predictable. When someone enters their world and disrupts that balance, the first reaction is often resistance. They don't always ask, "Is this person wrong?" Sometimes they simply feel, "I don't like how this makes me feel," and they mistake that emotion for proof of danger. This is how misunderstandings begin. A person who speaks uncomfortable truths is labeled negative. A person who refuses to follow unhealthy traditions is called difficult. A person who exposes contradictions is accused of creating problems. The focus shifts from the message to the messenger because attacking the person is easier than examining the truth behind their words. The uncomfortable reality is that growth rarely feels comfortable in the beginning. A new idea, a difficult conversation, or an honest reflection can create tension before it creates improvement. Many breakthroughs in life started as things people resisted because they threatened old beliefs. The first response to change is often rejection, not because change is wrong, but because change demands adjustment. The crowd's mistake is confusing peace with silence and agreement with truth. A room where nobody challenges anything may look peaceful, but it can also be a place where problems are quietly protected. Real progress requires people who are willing to create healthy discomfort, not unnecessary conflict. The person everyone calls a problem is sometimes the only one brave enough to point out that the problem already existed. They did not create the cracks, they simply refused to cover them up, and that is why they are often misunderstood. They are judged by the discomfort they create rather than the truth they reveal. Sometimes the greatest danger is not the person who makes people uncomfortable. Sometimes the greatest danger is a group so afraid of discomfort that they would rather protect a familiar mistake than accept an uncomfortable truth. Number 7. The more you refuse to worship their approval, the more ruthless they became. There is a hidden power that many people underestimate, the power of approval. For many, acceptance is not just something they enjoy, it is something they use to influence others. Praise becomes a reward, Rejection becomes a punishment. The moment someone realizes they can no longer control you through validation, they often become uncomfortable because their usual methods stop working. When you no longer need everyone to like you, something changes. You become harder to manipulate. You stop changing your values just to avoid criticism. You stop explaining every decision to people who have already decided to misunderstand you. You stop chasing invitations from places where your presence is only valued when you are convenient. That kind of freedom can be threatening to people who benefited from your need to be accepted. The reaction can be surprising. Instead of respecting your independence, some people try harder to break it. They may question your character, bring up your past mistakes, or remind you of everything you could lose. Not because they are truly concerned, but because they sense that their influence is fading. When control disappears, resistance often appears. The uncomfortable truth is that some relationships survive only because one person is constantly seeking approval from the other. The moment that person develops confidence and starts standing firmly on their own, the entire dynamic changes. What was once called respect may suddenly reveal itself as obedience. What was called care may reveal itself as control. But there is a reason people who stop begging for approval become powerful. They begin making decisions from purpose rather than pressure. They are no longer guided by the fear of being disliked. They understand that being accepted by everyone often requires becoming a version of yourself that satisfies everyone except you. The greatest shift happens when you realize your worth was never supposed to be decided by a crowd. A crowd can celebrate you today and criticize you tomorrow. Their opinions change with circumstances, emotions, and convenience. But a person who knows their values does not collapse every time the room changes its mind. That is why some people become more aggressive when they realize they cannot control you anymore. Your freedom exposes the chains they thought everyone should wear. Your confidence reminds them that approval was never supposed to be a prison. You didn't become difficult to love. You simply became impossible to own. Number 8. You became the mirror. Everyone wanted broken. The most uncomfortable people to be around are not always the ones who attack others. Sometimes they are the ones who reveal things without saying much at all. They become a mirror that reflects what people would rather keep hidden. The mirror is not creating the flaws, the insecurities, or the contradictions. It is simply showing what already exists. This is why certain people can trigger strong reactions without doing anything wrong. Your discipline may remind someone of their own lack of commitment. Your honesty may expose the lies they have been telling themselves. Your confidence may highlight the fears they have been trying to hide. Instead of accepting what they see, they blame the mirror for showing the reflection. It is easier to criticize the person who reveals uncomfortable truths than to confront the truth itself. This is a pattern that happens everywhere. The person who points out a problem becomes the problem. The person who refuses to participate in unhealthy behavior becomes the difficult one. The person who asks the question everyone avoids becomes the person everyone wants to silence. The reason mirrors are often hated is because they remove excuses. They do not allow people to hide behind the stories they have created about themselves. They reveal the difference between who someone claims to be and who their actions show them to be. That realization can be painful, especially for those who have spent years avoiding self-reflection. But the strange thing about mirrors is that they do not need to fight. They do not need to prove anything. They simply exist. Eventually, the person looking into the mirror must decide whether to break it or change what they see. This is why people who live with honesty often become targets. Their existence challenges people who have become comfortable with pretending. They represent a standard that cannot be negotiated. They remind others that excuses are choices and that growth requires personal responsibility. The attempt to break the mirror is usually an attempt to avoid the reflection. But destroying the person who reveals the truth does not destroy the truth itself. The image remains. The lesson remains. And eventually, even those who rejected the mirror may realize that the person they blamed was never their enemy. They were simply the reflection they were not ready to face. Number 9. The labels they gave you became a prison they built for themselves. One of the most dangerous things people can do is turn a person into a label. Once someone decides who you are, they often stop paying attention to who you are becoming. They take one moment, one mistake, one disagreement, or one misunderstood action and use it as the foundation for an entire story about your character. Suddenly, you are no longer a human being with layers and growth. You become a word they repeat. The strange thing about labels is that they often reveal the limitations of the person creating them. Calling someone arrogant may be easier than admitting they are confident. Calling someone difficult may be easier than admitting they have boundaries. Calling someone rebellious may be easier than accepting that they are brave enough to question what others blindly follow. Once a label becomes popular, people start collecting evidence to protect it. They notice everything that supports their belief and ignore everything that challenges it. Your kindness becomes an exception. Your achievements become luck. Your good intentions become suspicious. The label becomes stronger than reality because people become emotionally attached to being right. But eventually, the label becomes a burden for the people who created it. Why? Because defending a false image requires constant effort. They have to ignore your growth. They have to explain away your progress. They have to keep telling the same old story even when the evidence no longer supports it. A person trapped by their own judgment is often more imprisoned than the person they judged. The greatest mistake people make is believing they can freeze someone in a single moment forever. They forget that human beings change, learn, heal, and evolve. The person they criticized yesterday may become someone they respect tomorrow, but admitting that requires humility. A label may control how people see you, but it cannot control who you become. Time has a way of separating reputation from reality. Eventually, the truth becomes louder than the opinions built around you. The irony is that the people who tried to reduce you to a single word often revealed their own inability to see beyond one. They created a prison for your identity, but they were the ones locked inside it, trapped by a version of you that no longer existed. Number 10. Your greatest threat was never your strength, but your immunity to collective delusion. Throughout history, some of the most uncomfortable people have not been the loudest or the most powerful. They were the ones who could not be easily convinced to believe something simply because everyone else believed it. They had the ability to step back, observe, and notice what others had accepted without thinking. That kind of awareness can be more threatening than any display of strength. Groups often create a sense of safety through agreement. When everyone repeats the same ideas, follows the same patterns, and avoids the same uncomfortable topics, it creates an illusion of peace. But agreement is not always the same as truth. Sometimes it is simply the result of people being afraid to stand alone. A person who thinks independently disrupts that comfort. They ask why when everyone else says, "That is just how things are." They notice contradictions that others ignore. They question traditions that no longer make sense. They refuse to participate in something simply because it has become popular. To someone who depends on collective thinking, this independence can feel like rebellion. The interesting thing is that independent thinkers are often misunderstood because they do not always provide immediate comfort. They may challenge ideas that people are emotionally attached to. They may reveal problems that others would rather leave untouched. Their goal is not always to create conflict. Sometimes their goal is simply to stop pretending. This is why societies, organizations, and even small groups can become defensive when faced with someone who cannot be controlled by popular opinion. A person who thinks freely cannot be easily pressured by shame, fear, or the desire to fit in. They are guided by principles rather than popularity. The real threat they represent is not that they know everything. It is that they are willing to admit when something does not make sense. They understand that being surrounded by agreement does not guarantee being surrounded by truth. In the end, the person who refuses to join a collective illusion often becomes the person blamed for disturbing the peace. But sometimes the peace everyone is protecting is not real peace at all. Sometimes it is simply the silence that exists when nobody is brave enough to challenge what has been accepted for too long. Your greatest strength was never proving that you were right. It was having the courage to keep searching for what was true when everyone else had already stopped looking. Number 11. They mistook mercy for weakness until they realized it was discipline. Many people have a misunderstanding about strength. They believe strength is proven by how loudly someone responds, how quickly they fight back, or how much damage they can cause when they are hurt. But there is another kind of strength that is far more difficult to develop, the ability to have power and still choose restraint. When people wrong you, they often expect a reaction. They expect anger, revenge, or a desperate attempt to prove yourself. They are prepared for a battle because battles are easier to understand. What confuses them is when you refuse to give them the response they were hoping for. Your decision to remain controlled forces them to confront something uncomfortable. You were never powerless. You were choosing your actions. Mercy is often misunderstood because people associate kindness with weakness. They assume that if someone does not strike back, they must not be capable of doing so. But there is a major difference between someone who cannot respond and someone who chooses not to. One comes from limitation. The other comes from discipline. A person who has mastered themselves does not allow every insult, betrayal, or unfair action to control their behavior. They understand that losing control gives someone else power over their emotions. They recognize that not every battle deserves their energy and not every person deserves access to their peace. This is what surprises people the most. They may spend years believing they have defeated you because you did not respond the way they expected. Then they eventually realize your restraint was never surrender. It was self-control. You were not silent because you had nothing to say. You were not calm because you were afraid. You were simply refusing to become a reflection of the very behavior that hurt you. The hardest person to defeat is not always the person who fights the hardest. Sometimes it is the person who has enough control over themselves that they cannot be dragged into unnecessary chaos. Mercy requires more strength than revenge because revenge is an emotional reaction, but discipline is a conscious decision. Anyone can react when they are hurt. It takes a different level of character to remain grounded when you have every reason not to. They mistook your kindness for weakness because they could not understand the power behind your restraint. They saw what you refused to do, but they failed to recognize the strength it took to refuse. Number 12. History repeats one cruel habit. It honors people only after it stops fearing them. One of the strangest patterns in human behavior is that people often reject what they later celebrate. The same qualities that make someone unpopular in one moment can become the exact reasons they are admired years later. Courage is often criticized before it is respected. Different thinking is often mocked before it is recognized. The person who challenges the accepted way of doing things is rarely welcomed immediately, because change usually feels threatening before it feels necessary. People are naturally drawn to what is familiar. Familiar ideas feel safe because they do not demand that anyone rethink their choices. But when someone introduces a new perspective or exposes a hidden problem, they create uncertainty. Instead of asking whether the message has value, many people focus on the discomfort it creates. They judge the person before they understand the purpose behind their actions. This is why many individuals are misunderstood during their most important moments. They are viewed through the emotions of the present rather than the impact of the future. Their struggles, sacrifices, and decisions are judged without the benefit of time. The world often waits until the results become undeniable before admitting that the person they rejected may have been ahead of their time. The irony is that recognition often arrives when the original resistance no longer has power. Once the threat is gone, people feel safer appreciating what they once rejected. They can praise the courage because they no longer have to face the discomfort that came with it. But the truth is that a person's value does not begin when others finally recognize it. Approval does not create greatness. It only reveals what was already there. A person with vision does not become valuable because the crowd finally understands them. The crowd simply catches up to something that existed all along. This is the painful reality of being different. Sometimes the very thing that separates you from others is the thing that eventually makes you unforgettable. The world may need time to understand what it cannot immediately accept. But time has a way of exposing what fear tried to hide. The people who are remembered are often not the ones who perfectly fit their era. They are the ones who had the courage to stand outside it long enough to change it. Number 13. The hunt was never about catching you. It was about warning everyone else not to become you. Sometimes the harshest treatment given to one person is not only about that person. It becomes a message sent to everyone watching. When someone refuses to follow the expected path, challenges a comfortable belief, or refuses to surrender their identity, the reaction against them can become bigger than the original disagreement. The goal is no longer just to correct them, it is to discourage others from following the same path. This is how fear spreads. People do not always need to destroy an idea if they can make people afraid to express it. By isolating one person, attacking their reputation, or making their journey look impossible, others receive a silent warning. Do not step outside the lines. The punishment becomes a lesson designed to protect the existing order. But what many fail to understand is that authenticity cannot be completely erased. A person who stands firmly in their values often influences others without even trying. People notice courage, they notice consistency, they notice when someone refuses to trade their principles for acceptance. Even those who criticize them may secretly respect the strength it takes to remain standing. The irony is that attempts to make someone an example can create the opposite result. Instead of showing people why they should stay silent, it reveals how uncomfortable some systems become when faced with honesty. It exposes the fear behind the reaction. If a simple voice or a different perspective is treated as a major threat, people begin asking why. The greatest mistake is assuming that fear will always control people. Sometimes seeing someone punished for being different awakens something inside others. They begin questioning the rules they accepted without thought. They start noticing patterns they ignored before. The person being targeted may appear alone, but their experience often reveals something much larger. It shows where pressure exists, where freedom is limited, and where people are being encouraged to choose comfort over truth. The hunt was never just about one person. It was about protecting a way of thinking. But history has shown that ideas built on fear rarely survive forever. The attempt to silence one voice can sometimes become the very thing that inspires many others to finally speak. Number 14. The Messiah is rarely recognized. Because people expect rescue to look comfortable. One of the greatest misunderstandings in human history is the belief that meaningful change always arrives in a way that feels easy to accept. People often imagine that the person who brings transformation will come with perfect timing, perfect words, and a personality that makes everyone comfortable. But real change rarely works that way. The person who challenges what is broken often creates discomfort before they create progress. The reason is simple. People naturally protect what they know. Even when something is not working, familiarity can feel safer than change. A person who exposes problems, questions old habits, or refuses to participate in harmful patterns can be viewed as a threat instead of a solution. Their message may be valuable, but their presence forces people to confront things they would rather avoid. This is why many individuals are judged by their delivery instead of the truth they carry. People focus on whether they like the person rather than whether the message has meaning. They criticize the personality, the background, or the approach because those things are easier to attack than the uncomfortable reality being revealed. The irony is that the qualities that make someone difficult to accept are often the same qualities that allow them to create change. Their courage makes them unpopular. Their honesty makes them misunderstood. Their refusal to compromise makes them appear difficult. But without those qualities, they would simply become another person who noticed the problem and chose to stay quiet. A true transformation does not always begin with applause. Sometimes it begins with resistance, criticism, and rejection. The person creating change may have to walk through misunderstanding before they experience recognition. They may be judged by people who only see the disruption and fail to see the purpose behind it. The greatest mistake people make is expecting something valuable to arrive without challenging their comfort. They want the benefits of change without experiencing the discomfort of transformation. Sometimes the person everyone questions is the person who reveals what everyone needed to see. Sometimes the one rejected by the crowd is the one carrying a message the crowd was not prepared to receive. The world often recognizes greatness only after it has finished resisting it. The lesson is not that every rejected person is automatically right, but that rejection alone is not proof of being wrong. Sometimes the very resistance someone faces reveals how deeply their presence has challenged something that needed to change. The Messiah is rarely recognized because people expect rescue to look comfortable. One of the greatest misunderstandings in human history is the belief that meaningful change always arrives in a way that feels easy to accept. People often imagine that the person who brings transformation will come with perfect timing, perfect words, and a personality that makes everyone comfortable. But real change rarely works that way. The person who challenges what is broken often creates discomfort before they create progress. The reason is simple. People naturally protect what they know. Even when something is not working, familiarity can feel safer than change. A person who exposes problems, questions old habits, or refuses to participate in harmful patterns can be viewed as a threat instead of a solution. Their message may be valuable, but their presence forces people to confront things they would rather avoid. This is why many individuals are judged by their delivery instead of the truth they carry. People focus on whether they like the person rather than whether the message has meaning. They criticize the personality, the background, or the approach because those things are easier to attack than the uncomfortable reality being revealed. The irony is that the qualities that make someone difficult to accept are often the same qualities that allow them to create change. Their courage makes them unpopular. Their honesty makes them misunderstood. Their refusal to compromise makes them appear difficult. But without those qualities, they would simply become another person who who noticed the problem and chose to stay quiet. A true transformation does not always begin with applause. Sometimes it begins with resistance, criticism, and rejection. The person creating change may have to walk through misunderstanding before they experience recognition. They may be judged by people who only see the disruption and fail to see the purpose behind it. The greatest mistake people make is expecting something valuable to arrive without challenging their comfort. They want the benefits of change without experiencing the discomfort of transformation. Sometimes the person everyone questions is the person who reveals what everyone needed to see. Sometimes the one rejected by the crowd is the one carrying a message the crowd was not prepared to receive. The world often recognizes greatness only after it has finished resisting it. The lesson is not that every rejected person is automatically right, but that rejection alone is not proof of being wrong. Sometimes the very resistance someone faces reveals how deeply their presence has challenged something that needed to change.